On this episode of Old School Monster Life, we start tackling some of the old projects on Earthquake and try to get them ready. Okay, so one of the things that's been wrong with Earthquake is the rear drive shaft. Now I use drive shaft loosely because it resembles more of a steel jump rope. It is so far out of round it's not even funny. I'm talking like a half an inch to 3/4 of an inch out of round. It's bent into a horseshoe just about. And I'm tired of shaking my teeth loose at the top end of the track. So we're going to fix that. Now I made new drive shafts for Danger Ranger. And while I was at the supply house getting new steel for that truck's tubes, I got extra so I can finally fix Earthquake's drive shaft. So we're going to walk you through how to do that, replacing the tube. Because the ends of the drive shaft are still good, it's just the tube. Mainly because it's been broken, thrown out of the truck so many times and welded back together and shoved back in there. Yeah, it's in bad shape. So what we're going to do is replace the tube in the drive shaft. So here we are. Here is the old drive shaft. And here are some of the battle scars. There's a big dent there. And there's some more up here. And you can't run your fingers over it, but basically everywhere you see a scratch is an indentation. And yeah, it's just not in good shape anymore. Not to mention the fact that you can see it's not straight with the naked eye. And a few thousandths out makes a difference. What do you think, 5/8 of an inch does? So anyway, we're going to start cutting this one apart and getting the new tube ready to go back in. So first thing we got to do is measure the length. Now the length goes from this weld here to this weld here, that weld. So we're going to measure that. Now this has a slip yoke, so if we're off 1/8, 1/4 of an inch, it doesn't matter because the slip yoke will take up the space. If you're off 1 inch, that might matter. So be as close as you can. Okay, so the tube is 38.5 inches long. Now we have to remove the tube from the drive shaft, or remove the ends from the tube. And how we do that is pretty simple. We are going to take an angle grinder, and this weld here, with a 1/4 inch stone, we're going to grind that weld out. Now, something to consider, drive shaft tubes are anywhere from 0.65 wall thickness for like a regular pickup truck or car, up to 0.95. So that's 95 thousandths of an inch deep on the tube. Now the weld is sticking up 1/16 of an inch, maybe 3/32. So that plus your 0.95 or 0.65 is all the further you want to grind down. You do not want to cut it off flush and wreck your end, because I'll show you why when I get this ground down. But you just want to grind the weld out. You don't want to actually cut anything. So let me get that done and I'll show you where we're at. Okay, I have the first weld ground down, and this is what you should have when you do it. And you see, all I did was take the weld out. And I'm not sure if you can see it, but you'll see a faint ring in the bottom of the weld. That's the ring you want to see, because what that is where the drive shaft and the weld met the yoke end. That's why I said you don't want to just cut through it, because when I pop the slip yoke out, you'll see what I'm talking about, and I need both hands, so I'm going to have to come back to you in a second here. Okay, now this is why I said that you don't cut all the way through the end, because what you don't see on the outside is the yoke actually sleeves inside the tube. So now you can see the part that sleeves inside. This here was the weld here, and then from here to here was actually sleeved inside the tube. So that's why you don't want to cut it. Just cut the end off, because that is actually going to keep your drive shaft straight when you go to put it back together. Now, I want to put this out there. This is an old school monster truck, and it's got straight axles, meaning there is no planetary ends. The gear reduction happens at the drop box. So I'm currently running a 3-to-1 reduction in the drop box. I'm actually going to gear it down a little bit so it's closer to 4-to-1. The drive shafts at 5,500 RPMs will spin about 1,200 RPMs. So it's not as critical on my truck to have a perfectly true straight drive shaft. Now, I've done this on street cars, and rolling down the highway at 55, you might have a real slight vibration, nothing major, and this is without balancing the drive shaft. If you take that same drive shaft and have it balanced, the vibration goes away and everything's cool. I don't bother to balance my drive shafts because they just don't spin fast enough. But if you have planetary axles in your truck, this is a really bad idea to put an unbalanced drive shaft in it, because your gear reduction happens at the hubs. You run either an overdriven case or a 1-to-1 case, so your drive shafts are spinning 10,000 RPMs. That's a whole lot different. So have your drive shafts balanced. Build them, that's fine. Make sure they're straight, but have them balanced so they don't fly apart, because shrapnel in the audience is a bad thing. Okay, so now we have 2 ends and a tube. So here's the 5-ton yoke end. You can see it actually extends into the tube a lot further than the 2.5-ton yoke end. And I have this to mount to the drop box, and then the adapter part of my conglomeration goes to the 5-ton yoke on the axle. And then here it is what's left of the twisted, mangled drive shaft tube that has been in the truck for far too long. So now we're going to go cut a new piece out of the stuff I bought at the drive shaft shop. So there is my nice new straight piece. Now, you buy new steel at the drive shaft shop, they have a machine that cuts it perfectly square. That end is a perfect cut. So that is the end that we build off of. We're going to measure that from that side, our length, and then we will measure it many times around the circumference of the drive shaft, and then I take a piece of masking tape and wrap it around there. So any wrinkles in the masking tape will tell you that you don't have it square. And again, it's not super critical if it's a few thousandths out, not a big deal, because the drive shaft ends sleeve inside that and kind of straighten it. You know, if it's a proper fitting yoke end, it will straighten itself out for the most part. I mean, you have to do a little bit of finagling to make sure it's right, but you can actually make a pretty straight drive shaft doing this. Now, here's something else to keep in mind. There are 3 different thickness tubes, like I said earlier. The outside diameter for 3-inch tubing will always be 3 inches. The inside diameter changes according to what drive shaft ends or slipper yokes you have. So if you have an 065 wall drive shaft tube and you pull the end out of that, it has to go back in an 065 tube. You can't put it in a thicker tube because it's the end is too big, it won't fit inside. So you have to go find a drive shaft end that came out of an 084 or 095 tube so it fits in the tube you want to use. And like I said, this is 084. I think it's the middle thickness of the three that are the most common. So that's what these yokes came out of. That's what they have to go back in. So I'm going to start cutting to length, and I'll show you how I do that. Okay, so my tube length was 38.5. So what I did was I took some lacquer thinner and cleaned off the drive shaft tube because it's really hard to write on oil, and they come covered in oil so they don't rust. But I measured 38.5 inches, and I measured it all the way around the tube. So what I'm going to do now is take a piece of masking tape and wrap it around the tube, and that way I have a continuous perfect line that goes around the tube that I can cut on. So here's my continuous perfect line. Now that is where the tape overlaps. You can tell you have a nice line if the edges of your masking tape line up. They're all the way around on the marks I made, and there's no wrinkles in the tape. Now I know you can stretch masking tape a little bit, but the trick is to apply it loosely enough that it doesn't stretch and tight enough that it doesn't walk around on the tubing. So there is my perfect clean cut line, and make sure you're cutting on the right side of the tape where your marks are. So I'm going to cut on this side of the tape with my angle grinder, and then when I'm done I'll have a perfectly straight cut. Okay, so here's my cut. You can see the tape is the same width all the way around. I was very careful to cut right on the edge of the tape. Now here's my actual drive shaft tube. That is a straight cut. Now I do actually have a chop saw that's set up to cut straight, and I could have just lopped it off in there, but you know, this is for tips and tricks for the guy doing it in his driveway like a lot of us do. So this way will work just as well as a chop saw that's, you know, laser set up to cut a razor straight line. This works. Okay, so I know this is where I'm going to get criticism from everybody, but I've never built a bad drive shaft like this. So you stick it up on something that will clear the yoke ends as you spin the drive shaft. V-blocks would be perfect for this, but I don't have it, so I'm using a block of wood and another slip yoke from a 5-ton. Basically what I'm doing is that distance and that distance is always the same. Now I know that tube is straight, so that distance is always the same. So what I want to do is measure on a point on the slip yoke out here towards the end, but on a round part, because measuring on the ears isn't going to do you any good. But you measure that from there to a flat surface, and as long as that measurement is the same all the way around as you spin the drive shaft, that yoke is pretty damn centered. And right now that yoke is pretty damn centered because I have exactly 3 inches all the way around to my straight surface. So I can go ahead and weld this end in. Now remember I said about being out of phase. The first end doesn't matter because the first end can be anywhere. The second end is the critical one because that has to be exactly parallel and in line with the first end. So I like to do the slip yoke first, and that way that's the more complicated one. So I do that, weld it up, and then I can worry about the back one. So there you have it, one straight drive shaft. I can't stress this enough. Before you weld it, make sure that your ends are straight. If you have an eagle eye, eyeball it, because believe it or not, you can see a very small outage. If your eye isn't that good, use a tape measure. You can use a dial indicator if you're really anal. But as long as they're straight, it shouldn't vibrate, or vibrate very little. And again, I would like to reiterate, this is if you're dirt floor poor, running straight 5 tons or straight deuce axles. If you have planetaries, you can build it like this, but take it to a shop to have it balanced and make sure it's perfect. It would be better if you had planetary axles just to have a drive shaft made. So bring them your ends that you want and have a drive shaft made. That way they can put it in their jig and make sure it's absolutely perfect, because as I said before, planetary end axle, the gear reduction happens at the hubs past the drive shafts, and a lot of times you have to overdrive the drop box, which sends your drive shafts zinging at 5,500 RPMs or 6,500 RPMs, whatever you spin your engine at. But for me, my gear reduction happens before the drive shaft, so my drive shafts spin between 12 and 1,400 RPMs. You know, that's above idle. So it's much less critical for me, and I still have the drive shaft cages in my truck to keep it from flying apart. It's fine. I've run that drive shaft that was an inch out of round for 2 years now. Never came apart. Vibrated like crazy, but it never came apart. That's why I say I can get away with this. If you're running a straight 5 ton or an axle that is not a planetary end or a planetary hub, you can get away with building your own drive shafts. I highly recommend, if you're going to have a planetary axle, that you get them built by somebody that's got much better equipment than a tape measure, an eye, and a welder. But like I said, I'm poor, I'm running straight axles, I'm good to go. So that's it for this episode. Just wanted to throw that out there real quick. We'll see everybody down the road.